Bruce, maybe we can start off with talking about where you grew up and when you first came to Grand Rapids, and what you remember about that period.
I grew up in Kentucky, in a little town called Gravel Switch, Kentucky, where I had no idea that I was gay or that anybody else was. Had lots of interesting friends and family in that rural area. Finished school there, finished high school there, and went on to college in Houston and Valley, Nebraska, and Cleveland, Tennessee, and did quite a little extensive move. I finally wound up in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I pastored Metropolitan Community Church. Was an associate pastor at Metropolitan Community Church for about a year or so, and then received the call to come to Reconciliation Metropolitan Community Church here in Grand Rapids. That was in spring of 1987 that I came here. The thing that I noticed most about the town at that point was the reputation of conservatism and the horrible fear that the people had. Reconciliation at that point consisted of about 19 people, and they had a pastor but no building. They were meeting in Fountain Street Church on Sundays, but if you wanted to get in touch with the church, you called the number that was in the phone book. It was always answered by an answering machine, and the voice would tell you if you want to talk to somebody, leave contact information. The pastor will arrange to meet you in some public place, and we can have conversation about this. So not my idea of how to build a church, but then I was young and didn't realize that just how dangerous this could be for some folks in this area at that time, or at least how much fear there was: fear of job loss, fear of family pressure, fear of being labeled in some way, and fear of physical violence. So I started with a splash when I got here, first meeting as many of the people as I could that were already involved in gay community activities, which it was a pretty limited affair. Reconciliation, MCC, and Dignity were the only two places that anything was happening. But I met a wonderful network of exciting people there, and that was really the beginning of my involvement in the community here.
Before Concerned Clergy came into existence in town, but I'm just wondering, as an ordained minister and somebody who's been in the ministry for a number of years, and particularly ministering to the LGBT community, what kinds of challenges did you face in West Michigan, not only because of sort of the conservatism, but it's sort of the kind of the sort of significant theological differences? I mean, how did that manifest itself in ways that were maybe a challenge for the work you were trying to do here?
It was really interesting in this regard, because certainly the theological challenge was, and even is, huge in a church with a diverse and very eclectic theological background. But the vast majority, when we came here, the vast majority of people in the churches were very, very opposed to homosexuality. A lot of them didn't mention this, certainly didn't talk about being gay in any kind of positive sense of it. It wasn't even the nomenclature of the churches. But what I found was, as I came in rather unafraid, having been out for many years myself before coming here, and just walking into the religious community with the understanding that if there was a problem theologically or socially with my being gay, then that was somebody else's problem. It wasn't my problem. And so I came in with the assumption that everybody knew I was gay, and we were going to work together to make things better in the community. One of my first stops was at Grace, the Grand Rapids Area Center for Ecumenism, where I talked with Dave Bach and then his then assistant Betty Zylstra, and got some really wonderful, accountable questioning from Dave, and started a friendship that continues to this day with them. Dave's assessment, and he really went kind of on the line for me, for reconciliation, for gay and lesbian people, by saying of our church to the members of Grace at that point, this is not a one-issue church. This is a church that's interested in being involved in hunger issues and poverty issues and doing a broad range of ministry. And really, they're part of Grace. And so our church became a member of the Grand Rapids Area Center for Ecumenism and worked with them for many years. At one point, being able to help them start what was then called the Grace AIDS Pastoral Care Network. And I was able, through my work with the AIDS Foundation, to encourage some funding to start that piece, and it did great ministry. Most of what I encountered through the years that I was involved with the more conservative elements in the religious community was more heterosexism than it was homophobia. I remember being introduced one time on a panel with several people, and I was introduced by an officer from the Salvation Army who said something about me and then referred to my wife. And I smilingly said to him, not where I come from, and was able to express not every male clergy person is married, and not every male clergy person is married to a woman.
Well, so since you arrived in around '87, it wasn't much longer after that meetings were held to kind of start the network, and then efforts to begin organizing Pride celebrations. Were you involved in any of that? And if you could share any thoughts you have about that kind of effort, what that meant for you and the community to kind of to create this new entity and to try to challenge the city to say that we should be provided a public space to celebrate who we are.
It's a fantastic experience. When I had barely arrived in town, I got here in spring of '87. In the fall of '87 was the March on Washington. And a number of us went from here to the march, among Dennis Comack and Jeff Swanson, some other people that went along with my partner and me to that event. And we came back immediately in touch with each other saying, okay, we must do something like this. Grand Rapids has to have this kind of a presence if we're going to break the silence, if we're going to get through that glass ceiling, if you will. So we decided at that point that we really needed an organization that would speak to that, to those issues. And not so much, at that point we were thinking it'd be great to have this great big Pride celebration, but the reality was that we wanted something more sustainable than just a one-time shot at a Pride celebration. And so the Lesbian Gay Community Network was formed. I had the distinct privilege of serving on that first board, along with Dennis, and the president was a delightful woman who now lives in Australia. And she...
Is that Holly Van Square?
No, Holly, she was partners with Holly at that point, Gail DeYoung, or not Gail DeYoung, Gwen DeYoung. And Gwen was a fantastic person. We saw very much eye to eye on social causes, particularly feminist issues and that sort of thing. And at that point, in the gay lesbian community at large, the feminists, lesbians, gay males were having this interesting little piece, which was one of the reasons that we decided as a board that this would be the Lesbian Gay Community Network. not the Gay and Lesbian Community Network, because we wanted to emphasize that this was a different age, different era, different philosophy in the way that we would interact. It was marvelous to watch. A good number of folks on that board at that point could not be public at all. And so Gwen and Dennis and I wound up being the people who spoke publicly, but we became the poster children for this. We were the gay people in Grand Rapids, in West Michigan. And so any issue that had anything to do with gays sort of came to us. I remember one day being at the church, my office in the church, and getting a phone call from a television station that wanted me to comment on the commercial, the Nut and Honey commercial that people nationally were saying, you know, this is instigating gay violence and it carries some real stereotypes and that sort of thing. And so they came to me to ask about that question. So I got to be a commentator on national issues, which I thought was extremely funny. This little parochial pastor in Grand Rapids that is suddenly the poster child. But it was wonderful for me. It was a good thing for the church. The church built very quickly during that period because we got lots of coverage, lots of publicity. And we, very shortly after the board was formed and the organization began to take off, Lesbian Gay Community Network, we started talking about, okay, how do we best celebrate what we're doing in this climate, this place, with folks, acknowledging the fears of gay and lesbian people, the fears of the community. What do we do about that? And this very, very astute, bright, kind, activist group of people came up with the idea of having pride celebrations rather than a big pride parade. A pride celebration started out, I remember that first one where everybody had to have a straw hat or, you know, a mask or something so that they wouldn't, some came with sacks over their heads, literally. And there's some TV footage, I think, of some of the people with sacks on their head because we were anticipating that there would be news coverage. We certainly were playing it up because the whole idea was a celebration. And it was a far cry from what's happening now 20 plus years later when we have record crowds and people on the websites, you know, everywhere, all kinds of wonderful faces and testimonies and families and people working with these issues and talking about themselves and just having a good time. It continues to be certainly a political statement, but it was more of a political statement at that point. I remember Mayor Helmholtz at that point, who was certainly not the strongest advocate for gay and lesbian people, had denied permits, denied police protection, denied cleanup, those kinds of things for those first celebrations. And he had a furniture store. And around the furniture store, just shortly before the celebration, he had rainbow flags all around his parking lot. And it was because that he was uneducated that this was a symbol of gay and lesbian unity. And so Jeff, I believe it was Jeff Swanson, who wrote a letter to the editor thanking the mayor for his kind support of the gay and lesbian community by putting up all these flags around the parking lot. Needless to say, they were down the day after the letter was published. But those were the kinds of first-time experiences. Very early on, and it may have been in that first one, but at least by the second one, I had invited all the supportive clergy in town to come out, be on the stage. I asked them to wear their collars, if they wore clergy collars ever, for them to wear their collars so that they were recognized as being clergy in support of gay and lesbian people. We had a wonderful contingent of folks for those days. I think we had about 12 people at that. that were clergy in various denominations that took their stand with us on the stage and boldly proclaimed that not all religion was against gay and lesbian people. Now things have come, so far in the mainstream churches. It really is not hard to find a congregation that's very open, very accepting, at least tolerant of gay and lesbian individuals. But in those days, you could go to Dignity for your support openly. You could go to Reconciliation MCC, and that was about it as far as any kind of being able to be worshiping publicly as a gay or lesbian person. So we've come a long way, baby.
Yeah. You mentioned a little while ago that your involvement in the AIDS Foundation. And I'm just wondering, obviously the 80s is the decade when HIV/AIDS really hit the U.S. and hit the LGBT community very hard. So I'm just wondering, as particularly in a ministerial capacity, what do you remember about how that impacted the community here in Grand Rapids, and how were people kind of responding to that in terms of providing services and doing education? I mean, can you speak a little bit about that, the AIDS issue?
Yeah, when the first thing that I did, my first official act when I came to Grand Rapids as pastor, I arrived in the afternoon and was called to the bedside of a young man who was dying from AIDS-related complications. And he had been written up in Grand Rapids Magazine, had a lot of publicity around him, but under an assumed name, that sort of thing. When I got here, I got that call, went out, sat by his bedside and with his mother and him, and we talked for probably 10 minutes. It was obvious to me that he was very, very sick, and he said to me at that point, I asked him, he said, would you pray? And I said, certainly I'll pray. What shall we pray for? And his response was, pray that it won't hurt and that I can just get out of this. And so we prayed for him to have a gentle passing from this life. And even while we were standing there with his mother holding one hand and my holding the other, he died. And so it's kind of a graphic way to start a ministry in any location, but it set the tone for that 3 or 4 years of ministry. I had probably, as I recall it, about 60 funerals that I did of people that died from AIDS. And the reason was that nobody wanted to touch them, or else no one knew how to minister to them at that point. I remember getting a call, and this is one of the folks that knew they didn't know how to minister to this piece. But George Hartwell was at Heartside Ministries at that point, and he called me. I did not know him. He called me and said, I have to do a funeral of someone who has died from AIDS, and I really would like to tap your expertise. I'd like for you to come and help. And that was the beginning of this 20-plus year relationship with George that has been so fruitful, and we've been such good friends through several denominations for both of us. And so it's been, those were the kinds of impacts. When Roger died, the first man that I worked with, when he died, his mother and I tried desperately to find someplace that would pick up the body, and there was nobody. We finally found a funeral home in Cutlerville that was willing to come out and pick up and embalm the body and have the services in their space. There weren't people, everybody was scared. I mean, people were really frightening. This was a frightening disease. It was a stigmatized disease. And what the gay community, at least what I was sensing and what the gay community folks that I was involved with were seeing was, survivor's guilt, why them and not me? what's really causing this, what really transmits this disease, all of the external pressures that were coming down, and it was really a nightmare. At that point in MCC, the fear was that within a few years that a third or more, maybe half of our male clergy would be dead, which was a decimating thing to think about for a denomination. So it was a horrible, frightening time, but it was also a growing time. It was a time of seeing such compassion. The lesbian people who were my friends in the congregation were such caregivers for the gay men that were going through this. And I took my leadership from them, from people like Patty Gibbs at Reconciliation, who had been around the community for forever and was this tough and little bantam rooster kind of person. And she was so tender and so compassionate and willing to do whatever had to be done to take care of folks so that they didn't have to die alone. And from that, I took my lead and worked with that. I tried to concentrate my work on the spiritual, physical piece of this illness and doing direct service to the folks that were sick and at that point mostly dying. But I couldn't avoid in doing that some kind of advocacy and some kind of political work for the AIDS movement, which is how I became involved with the AIDS Foundation, the Grand Rapids AIDS Task Force, and those other organizations.
Then eventually, in the early 90s, the Lesbian Gay Network began an effort to try to get the city to pass an ordinance, an anti-discrimination ordinance. I wonder if you could just talk about that, whatever level of involvement you had, and if you were attended any of those sort of very contentious public hearings that were held, what you remember about, the atmosphere during that period of pushing that eventually, was a victory. But what do you recall about that?
Yeah, during that period, I had about 5 years of being out of Grand Rapids a lot. I was living in Grand Rapids, but I was pastoring a church in Detroit. And so I was spending a lot of time on that side. And so I wasn't involved kind of deliberately, I had been through so much stuff. I really didn't want to go through rehashing the same old scripture passages that I'd been rehashing with folks since I was 21, getting into those same kinds of arguments. And so I had really focused my attention on reconciling, on giving what I felt to be the truth that God wanted out and that I felt like society needed to hear about reconciling ourselves to ourselves. And so I didn't want to go through those things again. So rather cowardly, I did not attend most of those public meetings. The ones I attended were the good ones, the ones where George Hartwell and other folks were leading the charge, and it would be a gathering of gay people or gay supportive people, allies, telling why we should have this ordinance and being reaffirmed in that and lifting my voice. To talk about some of the things that I had seen through the years here that certainly gave voice to the fact that we needed that ordinance. So I was very peripheral to that public move, but very integrally involved in finding everything that I could, following everything, feeding in every way that I could to the arguments for that, because vitally important. And now I find myself offering my support to Holland in the same kind of voice. And I'm thinking, it's 15 years and it's the same fight. It's the same fight over and over and over. I get some sense of what other minority peoples continue to do, even if they have legislation in one place, they don't have it somewhere else. And the marriage equality piece, we're fighting the same battles that I fought for 40 years.
Yeah. Well, maybe moving to the president, Bruce. You mentioned earlier on that obviously there's been significant changes in Grand Rapids in terms of the openness, and there's not the kinds of discrimination, maybe it's not the same degree, but obviously there's still work to be done. And one thing we've heard from other people is just maybe in part is sort of the lack of spaces at some level. I mean, there was at one point, a wonderful place called Sons and Daughters that doesn't exist anymore. There's, what a lot of people have said, particularly older folks in the LGBT community, is that outside of the bars, there's really not much public or space to kind of gather and feel safe necessarily. So I'm just wondering what you think about that, and also what do you think needs to happen in Grand Rapids that would sort of further the cause of equality and justice for the LGBT community?
I think what we need probably more than anything else is a lot more Stephanie Sandbergs and folks that can creatively, artistically, inspirationally touch everybody. Not only do gay people identify with her story of the 7 passages, but the straight community and folks that hadn't thought about this a whole lot, and some who had been just adamantly opposed began to see the stories. Over and over in my experience, it's been that it's really easy to hate a category. It's not so easy to hate some specific people, particularly if those specific people are your neighbor, your friend, your doctor, your banker, your whatever, that is somebody that you can relate to personally. So from my viewpoint, the more of us who can take the chance, take the plunge, and say to those that we love, those who are important to us, I'm one of those people that you've been talking about, thinking about. The more that we can do that, the more public that we can be about who we are, just being real, being ourselves, being non-defensive as much as oppressed people can be non-defensive, in saying, hate me. If you're going to hate gay and lesbian people, transgender people, hate me. And the answer, well, you're not like them. Well, how many of them do you know that you know? And so I'm convinced that the more things that we can do that touch hearts and that reveal people as being just people, that's the overall answer. I think this is why that more young people seem able to have an openness towards LGBT issues and LGBT people, is because they know that they know some. When I was growing up, I didn't know that I knew anybody that was gay, including me. Mm-hmm. Even though I knew that I was different, I wouldn't have put that gay nomenclature to it. Mm-hmm. So the more people that can do that, the better that we're doing things for ourselves. And this is what ultimately makes the difference. It's what I think has brought us to this point, was those few bold people stepping out, encouraging other people to be bold, and just being who we were, that brought us to this space. And now there are, where there were maybe 3 spokespeople at one point, look how many people are known to be gay and lesbian, to be leaders in the community now, and then multiply that 20 years from now exponentially by those kinds of numbers. And one day it becomes, this is just like everybody else. And I think that may be a huge key to we don't have any place to go, we don't have any place to meet. We do have a whole lot more places than we did. But maybe what we need, the thing that I've been impressed with in Grand Rapids, particularly in the church community, is that I no longer feel the need to be part of a church where everybody is gay or lesbian, or most of the people are gay and lesbian. I can be a part of any number of churches of several different denominations, you know, particularly my church at Plymouth United Church of Christ is open and affirming for 12 years, 15 years, publicly, very, very much in the forefront of this. And maybe a third of the congregation is GLBT, but it doesn't matter anymore. You know, we can go to all the same places, do all the same things. If we're having a dance and my partner and I want to dance together, we just dance together along with whoever else. Or if we want to dance with one of the other people, we can do that, you know. So I'm thinking that that would be an ideal situation for me, is if it doesn't have to be that I have to have a special place where I can go to feel safe, that I can feel safe anywhere. You know, I think the biggest change in Grand Rapids, I felt the experience when I was flying out to Florida to preach an installation service for one of our new ministers there. And my partner gave me a hug and kiss at the airport at the gate and sent me on my way. So here are these two 50-ish plus guys kissing in an airport in Grand Rapids. And you know, there may have been, I don't notice these things because I've been ignoring them for 40 years. There may have been somebody who glanced up, but neither one of us felt the least bit uncomfortable. Neither one of us were fearful at that point in Grand Rapids. What a change over that 20-some years.
Well, certainly, one thing we're trying to do with this project is to collect stories, you know, sort of building on the work of people like Stephanie Sandberg, and to both demonstrate that there is a rich history within the LGBT community, a history of struggle, and gains have been made. But I'm wondering what you think, particularly about, you know, that's the thing about history. Sometimes only parts of history gets told, and certainly the LGBT voices are not usually included in history, not very prominently. What do you think about the importance for people, the current generation, the future generations, to understand that there is this history that we had to go through to be able to get to where we are now?
I think it's vital. I think it's absolutely necessary. Where would young African American people be? They didn't get to hear the stories of Martin Luther King and the other people that were doing that kind of work for civil rights for African Americans at that point. You know, I get a little disturbed that my children don't know about Vietnam. They don't understand black armbands and all the things that we were going through during that period, that the country was going through. And so things look very different. You know, there's always a freshman class. And we need to be letting folks know that we're all always building on the shoulders, standing on the shoulders of those who have gone before us, that things are just, if they're any easier today, they're a little easier because of the struggle that somebody else had. And if we can laugh some today, it's because somebody else cried our tears for us.
Well, I didn't have any other questions. I know you have you have to get out of here, Bruce, so I appreciate you speaking with us. But if there's something else that you wanted to say that you think that we haven't covered, you know, feel free to.
I bet with these 50 or so interviews that you've covered much more than I even have any personal contact with. But I commend you for doing this and feel like that this is a banner historical event. It's something that we absolutely need, not just for the gay community, but for the community of Grand Rapids, for West Michigan, for the United States, for history, for the world.
Great. Well, thank you again for spending time with us.